Hi, this is Paul, and we're planning on having a three-way conversation this morning if Tripp shows up. But if he doesn't, we will press on anyway. I am here today with Dr. James Wellman Jr., who is the author of this book, Evangelical versus Liberal, The Clash of Christian Cultures in the Pacific Northwest, and a good number of other books. And I was introduced to your work by Tripp, who was supposed to join us. And I found your work quite helpful. And so as I've finished up the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, I had a conversation with Tripp, at least two already with Tripp about that. But I would like to expand the conversation larger to look more at Protestantism in America, because I think your work has, oh, here he comes. Your work gets at a lot of those dynamics. And right now, actually, the current civil war between conservative and progressive evangelicalism is a big part of this. Here he is.
Sorry, guys, my 3-year-old, he's nap time right now. So I was putting him down and he couldn't find one of his toys. It was a whole thing. So sorry about that.
That's quite all right. And I didn't realize that you flew the coop out of Seattle and have taken yourself to a much warmer state.
It is, yes. Palm trees outside. I think it's close to 70 degrees today, so no complaints here.
Yeah, it'll get close to 70 here too. Makes one wonder why one stays in a place like Seattle, but we'll get to that. Part of the connection
clean
between
and beautiful blue skies forever back here. It's about 65 degrees and you just want to be alive.
Oh, well, that's
65 degrees. I'm gonna fact check you on that, Jim. It's 47 according to my app.
Well,
I was dreaming that, Tripp. I was dreaming that. I'm living.
You know what though?
Dream, baby.
You know what though? Come July, we're gonna spend probably the entire month of July in Seattle and Washington when it's like hot and muggy and miserable in South Carolina. We're gonna be in Seattle. So
good.
Yeah.
There you go.
So I was just Tripp. I was just starting the story as to how I was introduced here to Dr. James Wellman Jr., and that was through you. So I was talking a little bit about Mars Hill. I'm often talking about Protestantism in America, and you mentioned that you know someone who writes about this and writes quite a bit about this. And although your theological I don't know if it's, or at least your ecclesiastical tastes differ, you've read his books and you really respected them. And, you know, those of you who know Tripp from Twitter knows he has particular views and he's not shy of sharing them. So I thought this could be really a fun conversation. So many of you are a little more familiar with Tripp. He's been on my channel a number of times, but James, why don't you, well, I'm not going to do as much biography as I usually do, but why don't you start with some of your story, especially with respect to your relationship with Christianity, how that began to get woven together with your professional life. And then at some point, I'd like to do a little bit of compare and contrast, which I think you did nicely in your book on megachurches, where you wrote about sort of the height of the mainline churches in Chicago and then the transition, let's say, to evangelical megachurches, because I think that's certainly one of the threads we're going to want to follow in here.
Yeah, I grew up in the Lutheran church. So that was the time when the Protestant establishment was the establishment. And, you just kind of assumed if you're Protestant, you were part of the mainline church. So evangelicalism wasn't a story so much, at least yet. I think the mainline church, at least in my youth and in my young adulthood, had a really powerful impact on American culture, both in terms of you know, a more sophisticated faith system, and a prophetic system, you know, to critique the Vietnam War, to critique, you know, Republican nonsense, and to kind of try to move the country forward progressively. And so I went to Princeton Seminary and didn't particularly like it. Went into the church as an assistant minister, enjoyed youth ministry, but didn't really enjoy being a minister in a church. Left and then went to the University of Chicago Divinity School for a PhD. I worked with Martin Marty, thinking kind of a sociological take on American Protestantism, American culture, American religion. Worked at Fourth Presbyterian Church in downtown Chicago, 4,000 member church, you know, a Protestant mainline liberal church. That's a unique thing these days. Still doing very well. You know, had a huge impact on downtown Chicago, big ministry to Cabrini Green, a very famous ministry to the children at Cabrini Green. Brought people in from the Cabrini Green every week for tutoring and all that. So I did a lot of that work. Anyway, you know, sort of the short of the story is that I decided to do my dissertation on the church, basically Christ and culture, looking at Chicago through Fourth Presbyterian Church, through the eyes of Fourth Presbyterian Church. So it was very fun. And, you know, Martin Marty was my advisor and wrote the foreword to the book and had a great time. Anyway, left there in 97, came to Seattle, no jobs, as anyone who's got a PhD knows, almost impossible to get a job these days. And started teaching at the University of Washington in comparative religion. Was fortunate to get a job in 2001, and actually took the job of the professor who I had studied with when I went to the University of Washington in the 1980. And so it was kind of, anyway, it's a great story. So 20 years there, loved every bit of it, doing really fantastic stuff now, all over the place. Doing a class on a life worth living, writing a book on that, written on Pacific Northwest religion, written, you know, kind of trying to understand evangelicalism. I've done a lot of that kind of work, comparing it to the liberal church. You know, obviously know Tripp, love Tripp, respect him. You know, and knew him while he was involved in Marcel. Interviewed Mark Driscoll, myself. One of the funniest and most fun interviews I've ever done with a pastor. Total smart ass, very smart guy. But I wouldn't trust him one iota, as far as I could throw him. So, you know, that's the kind of guy. I think he's a super car salesman guy.
So were you, so I have a couple questions, Jim, just because I think some of these things you and I haven't talked at length about, but I guess, well, let me start at the beginning. You said you didn't like Princeton Seminary, but you know, then you go to University of Chicago. What was it about Princeton Seminary that you didn't like? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it was just, it was so Presbyterian, Tripp. You know, it was, you were being sort of trained in the Presbyterian Reformed faith. And it just wasn't my cup of tea. I mean, theology in general, as a discipline in and of itself, has never been my main concern. I've always been interested in how the church relates to the world, how it impacts the world, how it translates into real life.
Okay.
And that was just, you know, so I ended up doing my MA's, you know, my final study there on, you know, social ethics in in the 20th century. So it just wasn't my cup of tea. And then, church, as being a pastor in a church, it just was not intellectually stimulating. I actually loved youth ministry, which is interesting. And I've always done youth ministry. I'm not doing it now, but I've almost always done it, whether on the side or part-time in some form or another, because kids are so vital and so free. And so, they're just all over the place. And then taking them on work camps and work service trips in the summer. I've always done that kind of thing. So, and then I have my own faith as well that I've developed and et cetera, but that's another story. So
gotcha. Okay, so my second question, based on your setup, was, so you said that you interviewed Driscoll. Did he also interview you? Because he ended up using part of some interview, I think, in like a sermon series that you appeared in or something like that. And so
he sent his people to my house on Bainbridge Island, and he interviewed me. And
okay.
He didn't interview me, obviously, that his people did. And that was, some controversy about that. The idea was, and I only heard about this secondhand. I never actually saw it. But
you didn't actually see it?
No.
Oh, interesting.
I
Okay,
heard
so for the audience, for Paul's audience, I want to back up. Jim is the uncle of my wife. And so like the fact that Katie and I were going to Mars Hill, like Jim had very particular feelings about this. And so I knew that there was some controversy, but I think whenever you did your interview with Mars Hill or Mark's people, I never saw that video. That was part of like a sermon series or something before I even joined the church or I even knew my wife or anything like that. And I'm not even sure that my wife has seen it. And so that's interesting. So you never actually saw the video that you appeared in.
No, I didn't. I heard about it from somebody else who had been there. And the upshot was that in the interview, I appeared to be denying a Christian faith, which couldn't be further from the truth. And so for whatever reason, I didn't really want to watch it because it's too depressing, and I didn't want to be a part of. I didn't even want to have the feeling of seeing that happen. And so I wrote a letter to Driscoll and was pretty pissed about it. But never heard back. That's kind of been my take on him, is that he'll do anything to get what he wants, and he's good at it.
So he got the soundbite that he needed. You feel like he got the soundbite that he needed.
Yeah, that's exactly. So I don't think he cared a bit about me. And this is not to say I didn't. I admired him as an entrepreneur, admired him as a speaker, admired him, kind of his creative theology, evangelical theology. And obviously he had a big impact on a lot of people. But after that, I didn't, I didn't trust him.
Yeah.
And I think that's the upshot of the whole series on Mark Driscoll, is that the guy's not, you can't trust him. So
well, you mentioned many times to me that was the most fun interview you ever did, was with Mark Driscoll, that he was funny, that he was entertaining, that you felt like, it's almost like you felt like a friend of his during the interview, at least, like he was kind of drawing you out. And so that's you said that once, and I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Like that is kind of the feeling, that not necessarily what was actually going on, but that's you've said that a couple of times, I feel like.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think he's he's got a seductive personality, and you want, and it's big, and you kind of, and charisma, he's got charisma, and charisma means that in some form or another, this guy has the answer to the questions that you have always had in your heart. And for some reason, certain people make you feel like, oh yeah, they're speaking to me, even though they may or may not be speaking to you. But yeah, he had that very charismatic kind of personality. I did a seminar at the height of Driscoll's fame in Seattle on mega churches with a small group of undergraduates at the U, and half of them were a part of Mars Hill. And these guys were football players. They were athletes. They were, sort of very bright, very wonderful young people. So he attracted you, Tripp, and Katie, for sure. He just was that kind of guy.
Yeah, I moved out to Seattle not knowing. I had a couple friends from college, and they were all they were in Campus Crusade with me at Duke, and so whenever I moved out to Seattle, that's where they were going, and so that's where I ended up going, and that's where I met Katie, and yeah, I was there for kind of 2008 right up until it crashed and burned in 2014. Like that was I was a deacon, toward the end of it, in the church. So yeah, no, it is really interesting. I think that one of the reasons that I brought you up to Paul was, reading particularly two books of yours. One is one was, evangelical versus liberal, right? Is kind of the book that kind of contrasting like the more conservative evangelical faith versus like kind of the mainline liberal expression of faith. And how like, even though I felt like you're probably more on the mainline kind of liberal side yourself, I felt like fair and honest about the more conservative evangelical faith. And I felt like that was intellectually like very honest, because I was reading it fearing our Thanksgiving dinners, because I was like, are we gonna argue about this? Because but then I read it and I was like, no, I actually think that Jim is really being honest about that. And I was equally as surprised pleasantly about the High on God megachurch. So both of those books I really recommend to people, because you were not a Mars Hill fan, and yet whenever you like researched and wrote that book, you were fairly complimentary of the megachurch movement, or at least you like illuminated some of the reasons why they're catering to something that's really good. And so that's why I recommended you to Paul, and I think that's why we're having the conversation today, is because I was like, hey, just read these are really good.
Yeah. And
yeah, I appreciate that, Tripp. What I try to do is be radically empirical in research, and that means to actually see what you see, and not just take your prejudice, your pre-understandings into the research. And so that the evangelical liberal book really, it shocked me in the sense that clearly not only were evangelicals growing and vibrant in terms of their churches, but they were doing 2x, 3 times as much service to their communities. And so you talk to liberal folks and liberal pastors and liberal lay people, they'd always say, of course we serve our communities and evangelicals don't, or something like that. And, when you do the research, you found quite the opposite, that overwhelmingly evangelicals were doing incredible work in their neighborhoods and around the world. Now you may or may not agree with the theology, and sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. But liberal churches are dying on the West Coast, or are dead. And the other thing, I think, in terms of evangelical pastors, at least when I was looking at them, these were simply more talented people went into evangelical leadership. And what are you going to say about that? Other than that's the way it's moving. I'm not so sure it's true today, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. And the megachurch book is another story, but we can talk about that as well. But yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry. I don't want to hijack Paul's podcast. So I've been asking all the questions. So let me turn it back over to him.
No, that's good. That's good. I'm glad that you jumped in, and I very much want this to be a free flow conversation. One of the things I want to make sure we don't miss. So I was born in '63. Jim, you're probably around my age. One of the things that a lot of people, so I'm very cognizant of the fact that my audience is a lot younger than I am, generally speaking. There are a few that are older, but many are younger. And one of the things that has happened in America that I think you documented nicely in your book, I really enjoyed your chapter on Fourth Press in Chicago, because you were able to, in a fairly succinct way, demonstrate what you said initially here, that there was a day not that long ago when the Protestant establishment was the establishment. And of course, the neo-evangelicals came on the scene with Billy Graham and Carl F. Henry and that whole movement. But all of the public attention is now pointed at that movement and the heirs of the evangelical fundamentalist movement today. Recently, a couple of years ago, I picked up Jack Jenkins' book, American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country, which tried to highlight the realities of the mainline. And one of the big stories that I think, and I think, again, as Tripp said, I was really impressed with how the honesty with which you have pursued this topic, that something has happened to the mainline. It is nearly gone. And so for many people who either A, do not participate in church at all, or identify as atheist, they might hear about Unitarian Universalists, they might see United Methodists, PC USA churches. I mean, actually, if you look at the numbers, there's a tremendous amount of legacy churches in America today that still are part of the mainline, even though their numbers are cratering. And what you just said now was quite interesting in terms of a lot of the talent. I mean, so I'm a minister in the Christian Reformed Church, which is sort of in the middle. It's one of these ethnic denominations that is currently basically being torn in two, and that might happen this year actually over same-sex marriage, but torn in two over these issues. And what's happening in the Christian Reformed Church is that it's either being assimilated into the evangelical fundamentalist or the mainline. And so then you have this new dynamic which has opened up, which David Brooks just wrote about recently, of the splinter within the neo-evangelicals. And that gets into, I think, the emergent movement. And I've tried to do a little bit of talking about that because there's an amazing amount of similarity between Mark Driscoll, Rob Bell, and Nadia Bolz-Weber. And you would say, well, what on earth would Mark Driscoll and Nadia Bolz-Weber have in common? They're sort of like opposites, those two. And she has now become basically the flagship pastor for a particular segment of the Lutheran Church in America. They're all pointing to her and saying, she's the future. And of course, not too many years ago, I think Tim Keller and John Piper sort of had a never Trump moment in dealing with Mark Driscoll. It's like, is this the future of our movement? Because he certainly is taking all of the attention, and there's a church planting movement. So before we really dig into the Mark Driscoll, I'd love to hear, especially for our audience, a bit of a retrospective in terms of the power that establishment Protestantism had in America. And then it's really the big story over the last 50 years in terms of church in America is really the collapse of the mainline. Because prior to that, when you have the history of, let's say, coming out of the Civil War, which was a complete victory of Northern American Protestantism, and then, of course, you have the rise of the progressive movement. Once we get into the middle of the 20th century, the slide begins, and we're seeing nothing out of the mainline Protestant movements today that suggests there's anything arresting that slide. Nadia Bolz-Weber notwithstanding.
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, Bolz-Weber she's interesting. I watched her as a kind of a young pastor, and she has her own charisma. And you wanted to believe that this was the future of the main line. But from my studies, you're exactly right, Paul. The diminishment of the main line is so dramatic. I was up for, I'm not going to tell you where, but I was up for the presidency of a possible presidency of a mainline seminary. And I looked at the books, and I looked at actually the students, what's the quality of the students? And it was frankly shocking. And I thought to myself, no, this is not where I'm going. And I think that it's simply not, attracting talent. Bolz-Weber is talented, but she's talented. She's a charismatic talent, but she can't lift an institution. And an institution is constructed by many people, not just by the charismatic types. And when you think of her, you don't think Lutheran pastor, although I think she uses that as kind of a ploy to say, hey, I'm so weird, I'm a Lutheran pastor. And it is totally weird. And most people don't even know what the main line is, Paul.
Right. It's invisible in America.
Okay, it's invisible. I walk around my campus, and there used to be these mainline churches that were on the borders of our university campus, feeding and helping and serving the students. They're either blown up or dead or empty. And so,
not just dead or empty. I mean, this is another thing. When I was in Seattle, we were doing a church plan with a really talented pastor, and the Presbyterian Church in the downtown, it had blown up, and so we were like, let's just buy one of these old churches. Let's just get one of them, right? And we couldn't. It's not just the church is blown up, the institution has blown up. We could not, they wanted top dollar. They did not care whether or not this church that has been in Seattle for 100 years that we wanted to buy to build a new church in. They could, the denomination, the Presbyterian Church in the USA, for instance, had no interest in giving preference to another church to take over that space. They wanted it nope, top dollar, commercial space. So it's not just like the individual churches, these denominations are kind of rotting from within. They're dying across the nation. And so I think it's particularly acute in a place like Seattle or, maybe some of these cities, but the fact that I couldn't even go to the presbytery of the Presbyterian Church of the USA and be like, listen, we're Protestants, we would like to buy this church. Let's come up with a fair price. And they're like, no, you're going to compete with Nordstrom for this space is quite frankly was kind of astonishing to me that they wouldn't even care that much.
I for a while I was trying to sort of save the Protestant church or that, which sounds really arrogant, and then I just slowly began to realize some things are unsavable. And Paul, this is this distinction between those who are pro-gay and those who are anti-gay is so powerful. And if you're going to stand on that position one way or the other, you're not going to be in fellowship together. And you're sort of, your idea of what a human should be is so contrasting to each other that you can't even talk to each other at some point. And so the division in the church is unfortunately around that topic. And I can't even talk about it anymore. Not because I don't want to, but because it's almost insane to me. Because I work and live at the University of Washington, obviously. And so to even think of the possibility that, a gay person should not be accepted and normalized is just, it's crazy making. And so, I can't even understand what would be the position. I mean, I understand it, of course, but it's just, I don't know what to say about it.
Culturally, it's not even something that can be entered into that, like someone who had a different opinion on that cannot even be entered into. And I would say on the opposite side of someone who they will also not even be able to entertain that as like a second order issue either. Like it's too fundamental.
We live in different worlds, and I think it's sad, mostly, and I don't know what it means for the future of the church. It's not good what's happening. Paul, I mean, in your denomination, wow, you're really on the front lines of this basically implosion of your denomination. Your denomination is going to be torn apart. The Methodist Church is going through something similar. Presbyterians have, sort of separated already.
We already started that fork, in the 90s and over other issues, and it's going to happen again in the PCA even.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. The PCA is gonna fork on this issue as well. Yeah.
But I do want to get back again to this question of the implosion and the cratering of the mainline, because in a sense, you can't see what isn't there anymore, but the void that it has left is part of what's creating the climate we're living in with respect to our imagination of what religion is and how it's to be practiced.
Yeah, I think you're right, Paul. I love the church. I love the Presbyterian Church, and we're moving back to our Bainbridge house, and we have to decide what church we're going to be involved in, Tripp. And I'd like to be be in my Presbyterian church again, but of course, that may not be possible for my spouse. So, for some of the reasons we're talking about. But okay, this is going to sound strange and crazy making to some of your listeners, maybe, but I can fully relate to and talk to people who have very different positions on these issues and find them really interesting to talk to and respect their faith to a great extent. We may disagree, but we can agree to disagree and then move on. But but in terms of our culture can't do that. We're in our subcultures, and we all think we think the other subculture is bizarre and terrible.
Talk to me about who Fourth Presbyterian was in Chicago, when it declined, and some of your thinkings about why it declined.
Well, I'm not so sure Fourth Presbyterian has declined.
Okay.
I would say more that it's a church that really knows how to serve young people who are progressive types within the Chicagoland area and culture. And so I think it's done a very fine job, Paul, of maintaining kind of a classic liturgy with music that is both old but also new, and serving the interests of their clientele as best they can. So very progressive theologically. A woman is now in the pulpit. First senior pastor is a woman. So I think they're doing well. I think Chicago is an interesting city in the sense that you can still maintain some of the middle road, which is not possible certainly in Seattle. And I don't know how that goes for you, Tripp, in your city, but that would be interesting to know about. Paul, where are you?
I'm in Sacramento, California.
Oh, okay. So you live in Progressiveville, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Paul's basically a communist. So just so you know.
So, but there was a time when, my father basically transitioned an inner city ministry to African Americans into a church in the 60s and 70s. So that's how I grew up. So I grew up in a place which was majority African American. My father in the Christian Reformed Church was sort of a pioneer in inner city ministry. I've done overseas mission work, and the church that I pastor now was planted at the same time as my father's church. It also was sort of an alternative, a multiracial, multi-ethnic, kind of a progressive evangelical church. So I've my whole life long sort of been in the progressive evangelical space. And one of the things that I know, being mostly a minority pastor, now that you say, well, you're white, how are you a minority pastor? Well, I've been a minority pastor in every community that I've ever served. I've never lived in a community where that has been majority white my entire life long. So I'm very comfortable being a minority, but the majority minority things are always complex, because even in the Dominican Republic, when I was an expatriate, still my white skin and my light eyes and my North American ties gave me a status, so that in some situations in the Dominican Republic, I was very much on the underside, the group that didn't know. I could easily be conned or marginalized. On the other hand, everybody knew I potentially had access, and so that also gave me status. And so, the simplistic way that we tend to look at status and privilege in a lot of our cultural commentary really doesn't hold a lot of water, because every individual on the ground is part of a much more complex situation. All of this to get into the fact that in African-American communities, African-American pastors in some ways continue to have the kinds of status and access that in the beginning of the 20th century, white mainline pastors had in their cities. So in a community like mine, well, actually we have a Hmong city council representative in this area right now. We had a string of African-American city council people. We had a neighborhood association meet at the church. I was on a first name basis with city council people, but because my church is small and because my church is so odd, none of those city council people, if they ever needed something to push, were going to call me. They'd call me to use my building. But if these guys wanted something pushed, there's 4 or 5 Black pastors in my neighborhood that they will call, because they know if they get these certain pastors on the line, they can move thousands of people. Even if many of the people in these communities aren't going to church, these churches still had considerable political influence and power by virtue of who was going to church, where they stood in the community. And communities like this, it'll be the Black mothers that, you know, if the pastor says this, as long as the Black mothers are in agreement, the shadow matriarchy is still pretty powerful, but, you know, they can move mountains. And so city council people who are smart, and the mayor who's smart, you know, when we had Kevin Johnson, former NBA African-American mayor, I mean, he knew who to call if he needed support in certain areas. So you still have that in the Black community. And the African-American church sociologically continues to be different from mainline evangelical divides. African-American church is quite complex, but for most people don't have an understanding that a few generations ago, it would have been unthinkable to not have clergy around the public table with respect to conversations of public importance. And for example, you know, Barack Obama's first inaugural, Rick Warren prays. Second inaugural, they're going to have Giglio, but Giglio's on the wrong side of same-sex marriage, and so he basically gets disinvited. And now, if you're, let's say, a Democratic inauguration, you're probably going to have a Black pastor pray. You'll likely not have a gay, Unitarian, lesbian pastor pray, even in the Democratic Party, you know, but so, and it's that transition that is important, because even having Barack Obama select Rick Warren says a lot about how, in many ways, the megachurch sort of replaced the old style city center mainline establishment Protestant congregation as identifiable religion in America.
Yeah, you're exactly right. You know, what is the main line today? You know, is there a mainline leader in Seattle?
No.
Who would you look to? Probably in Chicago, the pastor of Fourth Church would be called upon, since she's a woman. But still, you don't know. I don't know. So yeah, the religious landscape has dramatically changed. And if you're not, you know, in more conservative churches, I suppose you enjoy the homogeneity of your church. I just happened to be a person who preferred being a lone wolf wherever I went. And I don't know, I can't explain myself other than I love being at the University of Washington, because I think I'm the only churchgoer in a faculty of 50.
In the religion department.
Yeah, no, and this is not it's a Jackson School of International Studies.
Okay.
But in general, very few folks are religious in any sense. And they respect my research, obviously, and like what I do. But, you know, I don't talk to anyone about faith. And they certainly don't ask me about it.
I was gonna say, would you even feel comfortable talking to people about it in the university? Like, you just being honest about your actual beliefs, right? Because I mean, part of this is just like, we can't have a church that can discuss both sides of some of these issues. Like, so do you feel like, I mean, both sides of the Christian, non-Christian issue, do you even feel like you could be honest about your faith as an academic and still be respected?
You know, I think people know that I'm a pastor and am Christian. And I think for the most part, they respect it. I think some probably newer faculty are probably, you know, really wondering, like, who is this guy? but they respect your research, and if you're a good researcher, or let's be honest, faculty basically don't care a rip about their colleagues. They're just doing their own thing. This is a lone wolf, vocation, and most of the time you're on your own. But I mean, as you know, Tripp, I've started the Global Christian Studies initiative at the University of Washington, and we've gained some funds and funding, and we may be getting a new professor who's African American, and so that could be really interesting. So there's movement. There's the possibility of growing that center in Christianity in a place which you wouldn't imagine it being. But that's compared to the fact that we have this huge Jewish studies program with 5 or 6 full-time professors in it. And it's an amazing program. So they're, I guess they're allowing the Christians into the club. I don't know.
But that's a dramatic change from, I don't have his book right here right now, but George Marsden has written extensively on the fact that establishment Protestants founded the American university system.
Exactly. I mean, I grew up with it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was my hero, who was an academic. And I kind of molded myself around that ideal of being, part of that intelligentsia. And the University of Chicago produced those people for many, many years. Martin Marty, being, kind of the ideal type of Protestant minister who could also speak across all sorts of religions and all sorts of denominations. And everyone trusted him. Yep. That's really kind of the feeling. Mm-hmm. He's 94 today, he's still alive.
Wow.
But
most of my audience would not recognize his name.
Most would not recognize.
Right. Most of them would have no idea who he is.
That's
but
hilarious.
He was, again, when I was in seminary in the 80s, he's a huge figure in the mainline church. Christian Century was a big deal for a publication.
Totally. So all that has changed, and I'm not sure what's really taking its place. But there really isn't a place where all sorts of different religious types can come together and talk to each other. I mean, Paul, you're kind of unique in that sense, I think, that you've stuck yourself into a place where you can talk to a lot of people who are different than you. That's a unique position to be in. And I really respect that.
Well, let's talk about, I think part of the reason, so if you read Molly Worthen's Apostles of Reason, which is a terrific book, she documents nicely how the rise of the neo-evangelicals becomes this thing, which I think is part of what's at the center of, something that justifies, let's say, a significant David Brooks opinion piece, a couple of Sundays ago, in that neo-evangelicalism, when it came on, managed to sort of harvest and accumulate this patchwork of postmodernist fundamentalist fight Christians who, there's a populism aspect to it, and they sort of brought these together very quickly. When Christianity Today began, their numbers dwarfed that of the Christian Century, even though Christian Century certainly would have had resonance in the institutions of power in the nation that evangelicalism didn't. But very quickly, Billy Graham is gaining access to the White House. President after president cannot seriously ignore Billy Graham. And so I think part of what happens then, I really liked your book in that mega churches are not the sole district of fundamentalist and conservative evangelical congregations, but they have very much colonized that space and have made use of that space to the degree now that at least one political party, in fact, does pay attention to them and in some ways dares not cross them. And that, of course, is not lost on the other political party for whom they're using their considerable influence and, organs of power, what some call the blue church, New York Times, network television to, and they have in many ways framed the term evangelical as fundamentally a political term. And so that in a sense, and this is where I'd like to get into a little bit of Mars Hill, you get into a place like, and I don't know the culture of the Pacific Northwest very well. I've really only traveled there, spent a little bit of time there once, and very quickly reminded me of certain corners of New Jersey because there's sort of a blue collar populism that's an underclass that's in the population, a sort of reactivity almost. So then Mark Driscoll comes into Seattle and builds a significant church with networks, employs media. And I thought The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill laid this out fairly well. Employs media to gain significant influence in a certain corner of the church in the United States. And the fact that he did so, I think, in a city like Seattle, he capitalized on some of the cultural potential that actually some of the cultural potential that Donald Trump was able to capitalize in terms of his rise to power. So talk to me about the Pacific Northwest. And Mark Driscoll is charismatic. Mark Driscoll has a terrific sense of humor. He's an excellent speaker. He's a smart man. He's all those things. Obviously got some pretty significant character flaws, but why did he succeed, and why did he succeed there? And yet I would imagine no significant political figure in Seattle or Washington was necessarily going to really try to capitalize. And basically, when it comes to public policy of Washington or the city of Seattle, boy, I better call Mark Driscoll and see if this idea is okay with him. That's not going to happen.
Guaranteed, he had more influence in DC than he did in Seattle. 100%.
Yeah, that's an interesting statement, and I think right.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, Tripp can answer these questions better than I can, but I think he sort of caught Seattle in this transitional moment, moving from a working class city, like you kind of mentioned, Paul, to becoming kind of this high-end, high-tech type city. And in between it, you have a lot of lost, I'm not talking about you, Tripp, but young men who are kind of searching for meaning, for purpose. Often young men who are very smart, sophisticated in certain ways, and kind of wondering, like, how do I create a life? How do I even find a woman? What do I do with my life? And Driscoll kind of comes sort of storming in with this really powerful ability to speak into young men's lives. And he did it with what? Music, and with culture, and with kind of a little bit off color, and with the idea that Jesus was no soft hippie. He was a working class guy like you and me, and he wants to save your ass, and he wants to make something of you, and I'm going to demand something of you, and I'm not going to be ashamed of the gospel. And I'm going to do it in an hysterical way. I mean, the guy was funny as hell. I mean, I don't know if he still is, but and he knew, he knows the Bible backwards and forwards. And I think he kind of found something that was really amazing. And he couldn't, I don't know, Tripp, does that explain?
No, I think that's right. I think that, and when you set all that in the backdrop of, like, I mean, we've been talking about the death of the mainline churches, in Seattle. It was the most unchurched city in North America. So you're doing that in the backdrop of a lack of any other options. Like, you didn't have, like, if you're a Christian, like, I'm moving from North Carolina, I moved there in 2008 to Seattle, right? So I'm an evangelical conservative Christian moving from North Carolina to Seattle. What are my other options exactly? Really, like, what are they? There's no other place that will make me feel like, is this actually a church? Do they actually believe the same things that I believe? Like what? It's going to be so disconcerting. So there's that. So you have part of that where you're just like, okay, you have some kind of group of people who are in Seattle who are underserved by the church because the death of the mainline, which is really all that existed in Seattle, right? And so you have this one church with this one charismatic leader who is, like, actually not backing away from some of the core things that you believe. But he's not embarrassed about it. And in fact, he's making it front and center, and in the most controversial way. In a way, he's being the controversial figure that you don't have to be. And so, like, I'm reminded of an article that I don't know, Paul or Jim, if you guys have read any of Ben Sixsmith's stuff, but he has a really good article called "The Sad Irony of Celebrity Pastors," and he's talking about Carl Lentz, specifically. And so he's like, his problem with Carl Lentz is that he's almost too normal. He's almost not controversial enough for him. And so Ben is not a Christian, but his last paragraph, it's always stuck with me. The last paragraph says, "I am not religious, so it is not my place to dictate to Christians what they should and should not believe. Still, if someone has a faith worth following, I feel that their beliefs should make me feel uncomfortable for not doing so. If they share 90% of my lifestyle and values, then there's nothing especially inspiring about them. Instead of making me want to become more like them, it looks very much as if they want to become more like me." And that, like, Mars Hill had that, but the opposite. They weren't trying to conform to Seattle cultural standards or politics or anything else. They stood out in that way. They were, at least, like, the way they viewed themselves, it was a city on a hill, right? It's a light in the midst of a bunch of darkness. And so you had that combined with a culture that was not telling boys, like, a lot of the guys that were in community groups and I did Bible studies with, they had no fathers figures. They did not grow up in the church. They had, like, this was a father figure to them in a certain way, and the church was fulfilling that role, and Mark was fulfilling that role in their lives, and so they were going for it. Like, this was the city on the hill for them, and so they were drawn to it. And the fact that they weren't backing down was actually an attractive element to Mars Hill in Seattle. That honestly, I don't think it would work. I don't think that if Mark Driscoll had done this in Alabama, it would have been nearly as successful. I don't think it would have. I think the fact that it was in Seattle, or maybe he could have done it in Portland, but like the fact that it was there that he was doing this was in fact part of the secret sauce that made the whole thing kind of work in a certain way.
Yeah, I was just thinking, he demanded something from you.
Yeah.
You know, he didn't underestimate who you were.
Right.
He maybe even overestimated what you could do. Not you in particular, but, you know, Tripp, I mean, for the same reason, when I picked up The Cost of Discipleship, teaching Bonhoeffer's book, you know, he basically said to me through that book, and I still think of it today. He said, when Christ calls you, he calls you to come and die. You know, that's a no shit Sherlock point of view. That is, you know, the gospel is demanding. The gospel is demanding, and it demands not just your pocketbook, your whole life. Take up your cross and follow me. And so, you know, for young idealistic young men, or at least kind of potentially idealistic young men, wow, that's kind of a real message.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always been, you know, and I've always been, if I'm a Christian, it's because of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's because he basically said, take up your cross and you must follow me. And if necessary, you must die for me. And who else are you going to do that for?
Right.
You know what I mean?
And I actually think that's a message that it resonates on all kinds of levels. It's why I think that Peterson is so popular with young men too. Like, it's why when Peterson came to Seattle to do his, you know, one of his, you know, it's a sold out theater, lines around the block, you know, with all these people coming, and a lot of them young men, is because that's a message that they're longing to hear, that I have a purpose. But that purpose, it's like an adventure, right? It's something that's demanded of me. I need to sacrifice for this. There's some role that I have to play here that is demanded of me. It's something that I think that especially young men want to hear. And, you know, Peterson would probably argue, you know, as he did with Captain Newman, like, what kind of woman would you want to, like, what kind of man would you want to marry to a young woman? You know, is it like a child who, you know, doesn't think that there's anything demanded of them, or do you want something else? And so, like, I think that that's one, like, I met my wife at Mars Hill. There's a reason that women were going to Mars Hill too. It wasn't just like the young men, sure, but like there were a lot of college girls at Mars Hill. That was also part of the appeal as well. And so, but Mark, I mean, he has that famous sermon where he's like essentially spending the entire sermon yelling at men, just absolutely yelling at men, and, you know, married men, single men, and like just the whole sermon is just that. Yeah. It's a very weird way to try and attract men, but it worked. It absolutely worked.
It's, you know, I mean, I've listened to Peterson, and, you know, he's not my hero, but what I think he does.
You're a little old for that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But what I try to do, you know, when I teach my Life Worth Living course, is I kind of, you know, occasionally I say, this is what your life can become. And the question is, will you take it up? I don't kind of use the language of faith so much as like take up your cross, follow me. But I say, it's up to you as to whether or not you're going to make the life you really want. And I still have guys who, you know, young men in particular, who call me up and say, Wellman, you know how that goes sometimes. Wellman, I love that class. You know, I just love you. And it's kind of embarrassing, but I mean, I just think that's just a part of what young men in particular need, and want. But our culture is either afraid to do that, or they want to tamp down men, or I don't know what I think men are really a conundrum. What do you do with men?
Mhm.
What do you do with them? And you give them beer, you sell them pornography, what do you do?
Yeah.
And I think Driscoll and what I would say is, you know, the Christian way: take up your cross, serve others. You know, I've had 4 kids. Now, why did I do that? I have 2 young kids, and I'm an old guy. I did it because I thought this is the most beautiful way to live a life serving the ones I truly love. And so I will give my life for them. And what else would I do? Go to Hawaii? You know what I mean?
You could have. Yeah.
You're pulling a page from John Piper right there.
Yeah.
You know, that's a big John Piper sermon right there.
Oh, is it really?
It is.
Jim, the evangelical. I knew we'd get him.
Yeah.
But I think
there's something to it. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
you want to be around men who have some purpose, who have some
Mhm.
meaning, who have some direction, who aren't just, you know, excuse my language, but just fucking around. You know what I mean?
Well, and see, this is the thing. This is what also makes it a little bit dangerous. And what happened with Mars Hill is that you want to be around men who have purpose, or you feel have purpose, you perceive as having purpose, you have like that kind of drive and that kind of call, which makes men like Mark Driscoll like, if you can convince people, if you can display that confidence that like, I've got purpose for you, I can do these kind of things, then you will get men to follow you into battle where you're just using them for various purposes. And so that's where it becomes difficult, because in a certain sense, I really like what Driscoll did with Mars Hill. I really like that he was actually, like, in certain ways, he was calling men to a higher calling than what was being called by the culture of Seattle, or what is still being called by the culture of Seattle. And yet it was being called to his purposes as well. And that's the sad part about it. And that's what, like, my big regret about being part of it was that it's sad to me that it was not pure, I guess. And that's kind of maybe a foolish thing for me to want in this life, but that's my big regret about it, is that it wasn't something more than what it was.
Yeah. No, and I hear you. I really hear that, Tripp, because I mean, I sense that from you, that you needed him at some level. And I'm not saying that as a kind of, you know, as a put downer in any way at all. I think men need somebody to look up to as a hero, in some form, and then as a guide. And if they don't have that, they tend to wander, and God knows what they do. In our culture, you know, I think, you know, Paul, I think you're exactly right. I think Jordan Peterson is a guide for men, and I think women look on and they go, many do, they say, thank God you're getting my husband off his ass to do something. And I like listening to Jordan. I'm not a huge fan of his, but you can see you can see the passion in him. He's saying, you have a life. Don't waste it. And I mean, my God, what's wrong with that? And so I like that. I like that piece of it. He's a little crazy, but I like that piece of it. Don't you think?
Yeah, he is.
I think the guy is crazy. He's crazy. I mean,
he's probably going crazier
what would it be
with
like
the
to
COVID.
be in Jordan Peterson's brain?
I don't know.
It would be like a madhouse.
He's a bit of a tortured guy in some ways, but I'd like to loop this back though to the fact that I think the loss of this is in the mainline, in the American establishment. I think a lot of it has to do with Vietnam, the counterculture, loss of confidence in the culture, because if you look at American culture coming out of the Civil War, I know for a lot of people, they're like, why on earth would you go back all the way back to the American Civil War? Because culture moves very slowly.
Yeah.
And, this isn't, right now, especially among progressive evangelical circles, there's this moral panic over Christian nationalism. And okay, but you've got Christian nationalism on what side? What's on the other side? What's on the other side? Just like the absence of the mainline churches. And I would say what's on the other side is sort of this Christian imperialism that had been the dominant force behind the progressive movement. When I say the progressive movement, I mean the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that really reaches its peak with Woodrow Wilson, in terms of the American progressive movement, where we're going to have, you had women's suffrage in that movement. You had temperance. Temperance movement was a movement on behalf of women and children, where men were supposed to rein in themselves, to get their house in order and to stop drinking so much whiskey. Look at whiskey consumption towards the end of the 19th century. And the temperance movement smacks into that. And in some ways, all of that masculinity, and so it's Kristen Kobes Dumais from the place where I received my bachelor's degree. John Wayne, but let's understand how John Wayne functioned for a generation that gave men a model of masculinity that said, go out there and spend yourself in protection of women and children, opposed to unmarried, raping, thieving, worthless men that are basically terrorizing the chaotic West. I mean, that was the narrative. Now, are there issues in some of these narratives? Absolutely. But in a sense, what happens with Vietnam and Watergate is that one narrative comes to an end, and the mainline, what does the mainline have for men? Well, I think it still had, and I think, when you talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship, I mean, when I was in college, I read that book, and yeah, that book rocked my world. In some ways, that was the Jordan Peterson book for me, because Bonhoeffer, stood up to the Nazis and was, as a neo-Orthodox, able to sort of lay it on the line. But neo-Orthodoxy was sort of the last gasp. And, where is neo-Orthodoxy today? I mean, it's you'll find vestiges of it here and there, but it's a spent movement. And the progressive church hasn't had anything that has formed its identity. And for the most part, it's been sort of this, new progressive wokish identity that the mainline, oh yeah, we've got colored flags and BLM, and that's what we're about. But everybody kind of looks at it like, yeah, you and Hollywood and Apple and, And at least, Apple makes my phone, Hollywood makes my content. I'm going to go and listen to bad music and kind of a half-baked rah message, and I'm supposed to give my money. And there's still a church there, but
yeah. So one thing that I want to throw out to you guys to see what you think about this, but one thing that, kind of in the undermining of our institutional confidence, right? So Vietnam and everything else like that. So we had all this like kind of undermining of what we thought were the authorities, right? The trustworthy people. And so like we've started to lose some of that. And so I think that like part of maybe the reason that the mainline, this is a hypothesis of mine, and I'd be interested to hear you guys see if you think that there's any, water to be held here, is the confessional, the more evangelical confessional faiths, where it's like, no, we're gonna like, I'm no longer giving my trust to institutions or people, but there's this strict confession that we need to uphold. And so that's where it becomes very hard to hold like kind of same-sex marriage and anti-same-sex marriage in the same church, because like the confession is what we're holding to, because there's no institution that we really trust anymore, right? There's no like, kind of interplay between like the hierarchy or anything. We don't trust the hierarchy. We don't trust anyone. And so we're going to hold to a confession. And that's where the evangelical faith, I feel like, has been stronger than maybe the mainline faith, which had more of a, denominational hierarchy, like the Presbyterian Church in the USA, the Methodist Church, and those kind of things, where, okay, but we've undermined that, and they're not really holding the line on any kind of confessional doctrine, but the evangelical churches are. They're not only holding the line, they're advancing, like they're pushing forward with some of these narratives. And so I feel like there's a certain comfort there that we all have, that, okay, I want to know what I believe. Like, I want to have some confidence that the faith that I have, or the church that I'm going to, or the denomination I'm a part of is real, right? That it's not just like fake or illusory, or just a thing that I do on Sunday mornings to hear a pep talk and sing some songs and whatever. And I think that that's the weakness of the mainline, is that we lost faith in institutions. And the only thing we have left is confessions, but that's precisely where evangelicals are stronger, and where the mainline church is the weakest, because they don't really have confessions that they're adhering to. Not really. So anyway, so I'm just going to throw that out there and see what you guys think of that idea.
Wow. I think I got out of the church, Tripp, because it was too depressing. And I just felt like it had lost its way. And all it was doing was mimicking what you hear in liberal culture, and not doing much more than that. And it was uninteresting. Therefore, it's uninteresting. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I believe I'm inclusive. I follow most of the inclusive ways that we talk about. What I would say, however, is that what does it mean to be human? Sort of the Jordan Peterson thing. What does it mean to be human? It is to structure a life that is giving away more than it is consuming, that is sacrificing for the sake of those they love, that has a higher vision of the world than simply finding how much you can consume, that has this stern purpose of justice, peace, love, forgiveness, and all that. So, but what institution is holding up that vision? It's mostly in my head. So, where do I go for it? I don't know. I really don't know. I think there's no perfect church for me, when I go to church, it's usually kind of a mediocre sermon. I kind of wonder, like, what am I doing? You know, what are we supposed, why are we here? What are these songs about? This is weird. It's just all weird. It's, to be honestly, it's just, and I just kind of go home and I go, okay, I'm going to go study my books because I'm a monk. And I'm a monk for a stern moral life that has a spirit, that has spiritual vitality in it. And that's, I find it in my books, which is kind of, it's just, there's, what institution can I follow? I can't trust the president. You can't trust your churches. Who do you trust? I don't know. I'm probably not really helping you guys out.
No, I think,
No, you're
I mean, but
voicing
honestly,
something that is not unusual.
No, it's not.
What
I
I'm
was going
saying,
to say,
let me put it this way. Let me just end by saying, I want to be a moral hero, at least for myself and my family, for God's sake. A spiritual moral hero for them. And maybe for a few of my students at school. I don't know. You know, that's all I got. That's all I got.
I think you're voicing something that actually is gonna, I think you're voicing something, Jim, that's gonna really resonate with a lot of Paul's audience. That what's going on his Discord and his YouTube channel and those kind of things is people who are kind of stuck there. That like, they feel like monks, right? So they're reading their books, they're watching these videos, they're doing these kind of things, but like this extra step sometimes is difficult for them of like, why am I going to church? Which church do I go to? Like what actually does that participation in, you know, in the Christian life maybe, or just life in general, like how does that go? I mean, Paul, jump in, but like, I feel like that's a lot of the people I talk to.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, Mars Hill basically presented itself, we're the army you've been looking for.
Yep.
And the rise and fall of Mars Hill basically is the post-mortem that, guess what? Mark Driscoll, kind of an empty bag when it came down to it. He didn't die on that hill. He didn't die on Mars Hill. He skedaddled.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, in that sense, you know, it's again, you know, the dream was stolen, I think, from a lot of people's lives, and because they had the dream going. And I kind of want to say to people, no, you have to create your own dream. And that's sort of what I think I am trying to do for my students, you know, by teaching that life worth living course. But also I teach Western religions. And then instead of, you know, deconstructing it or, you know, whatever you do, I construct the beauty of the Jewish, Christian, Islamic faith systems, and say, hey, look at this, look at this, you know, in certain ways, this is what happens to humans on fire with the faith of their tradition. Because there's so much beauty in these traditions. That's what I find. And that's what I try to do. I don't know what else to do, because that's what gets me up in the morning.
Well, and I think, I mean, you're what you just declared there was Jordan Peterson before C16 and 2016. And he was essentially doing that at the university, one of the most popular lecturers. His Maps of Meaning and Personalities courses, always packed. Students loved to hear from him, you know, took all of his Jungian stuff and here's a worldview and make your life count. And he was, you know, he'd been doing that forever. Then, of course, he's got this sort of Martin Luther personality that something gets in him and he's got to open his mouth, but he's got YouTube. Whereas Luther, of course, everything that Luther wrote, the printers were eager to, you know, let's get this stuff out there, and, you know, whoosh, off it goes. But the question is, and you see similar things, and the people who went into the radical Islamism in Al Qaeda, I mean, all that, ISIS, all that stuff. These are mostly college educated Western Muslims who grabbed hold of that. That was a response to what John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis. And then the question, what we see, I think, in evangelicalism has been, especially in the church planting movement, Rise and Fall of Mars Hill talked somewhat about the church planting movement. That's a critical piece of this, because in many respects, what the church planting movement gave were young religious men in America the chance, in a sense, to found their own armies, or at least to get a shot at it and to gather the people around. But
I'm so with you, Paul. Where I would withdraw a little bit from that is, with Peterson, I always find that there's a lack of sensitivity, a lack of, if you will, a lack of gentleness in spirit, right? What I love about the figures who I really respect is they're fierce, but they're also tender. And I don't see a lot of, I don't know, maybe he's got a tender side, but
get a VIP ticket in one of his events. You will see that he will give every single one of those 150 people his complete undivided attention for 45 seconds or a minute, and they will feel just in that moment like the center of the world. I will
send you a picture of, whenever Teddy was born, Jim, our second kid, he was 3 weeks old. And so Katie and I went up and we had the VIP ticket and we talked to Jordan Peterson for a couple minutes. Literally, we have a picture with no joke. I don't think he said 3 words to me. He was talking to Katie. How are you? Because clearly we had just had a kid, and literally all he's talking about is, how are you feeling? Is this your first kid? Your second kid? Oh, how, you have a lot on your hands. How are you feeling about that? Literally there was nothing political, and he wasn't talking to me, the guy, at all. He was just talking to Katie. Completely focused on her, and there was nothing inauthentic in that. It was just that's just what he was. He saw Katie and knew that there was a lot on her hands, and I think that there's a different side to him than maybe whenever he's just kind of arguing about something that is actually tender about it. So anyway, I would say that was interesting. He literally he maybe said, "Hey," and then he completely just zoomed in on, "Hey, you just had a kid. How are you doing? Are you tired?" Literally, it was just the kind of thing that you would do with your family. Yeah.
I think that's so that's what I'm calling for. I think strong men are beautiful, who have courage, but also can be tender, forgiving, willing to change when needed, et cetera, et cetera. So, that I guess maybe what we're talking about is a more comprehensive view of what it means to be a man.
Yep.
And spirituality to me is a part of that. And spirituality calls you to love, to be tender, to be forgiving, to be full of courage, to be willing to give your life for the sake of your community, your faith, and your virtues. But when do you hear about this stuff? Except for maybe Jordan Peterson, I don't know.
But
but that's the thing.
Had some of that too.
But that's the thing. I feel like there's two different sides of there's an anemic view of this on both sides, which is masculinity is bad, right? And so there's no masculine aspects that are good, and really there's that side, and then there's the other side where only the aggressive, like violent, like that's what masculinity is. And you just need to be more like that. You need to be more aggressive, go out, form your army, battle, like those kind of things. And then there's something in between that I think that we're actually called to. And that's where I think that there is an opportunity, but like I don't know that there's anyone doing it really well on either side. I feel like you're either shamed for being a man, or you have like the kind of the masculinist, they're trying to shame me for being a man, so be even more of a man than you would have been otherwise, kind of thing. And like those are both like an overreaction to, I think, what the real calling should be. Right. Like Jesus braided whips and he also wept with people. So like we need to be able to do both. And that's where I think that like Driscoll did some of that, right? He didn't shame men for wanting to be men or to be leaders, or like that kind of urge to like, to do those kind of things. And but did he also encourage men to be humble and repentant and, those kind of tender? No, not that either. So like he had parts of it, not all of it, but it's easy to see, especially in a culture like Seattle, where masculinity is viewed largely as a negative, right? We always talk about the toxic masculinity, like in Seattle, that's like almost like, that's just masculinity. You don't even need the toxic thing. Like you just say masculinity, there's a negative connotation to it. I think that in a backdrop like that, Driscoll, he was pushing back on some things that were good in a good way, and he should have done that. Now he has his own problems, but like that's what I think that like I said, I don't think that Driscoll would have worked in Dallas.
No.
I think that it worked in Seattle or Portland for those reasons. Yeah.
You take away from, I mean, this is a weird question, but do you sort of take, okay, I got some good things from Driscoll. At the same time, is he a failed human being? Is he a person who he just seems like, I don't know what else to say. How do you describe him?
I mean, for me personally, I know a lot of people who have never returned to the church after leaving Marcel. So that's really, friends of mine who have decided to never come back to church because of the abuse that they witnessed and or experienced at Marcel. So with that, like for me personally, also being maybe personality wise a little bit more on the Mark Driscoll, like I'm fairly aggressive and opinionated and those kind of things. I think that what I see in Mark Driscoll is a warning story for but by the grace of God, I go I. Like I could absolutely see myself falling into some of those things. And so for me, I learned a lot. I met my wife, had our kids, like that was, that's part of my story. For me, I'm more looking at it as both like a good and a cautionary tale, that like my virtues and vices, they can go either way. And like when I see Mark, I'm just like, yeah, like I totally get why he appealed to me. And also I can get why that those same things that made him appealing can also be abused, and I should stay away from them, or I should at least be aware that those are those tendencies. And so that's kind of like my learning lesson from Marcel, is more just like, yeah, I don't want to shy away from, like, there were good things, there were reasons that I went there. I wasn't like completely blind. At the same time, yeah, I wasn't blind, but I was vulnerable.
Tripp,
and so
do you think as a part of this kind of discovery of trying this, the show about Driscoll, don't, you know, shouldn't there be a moral inventory of this man that's as clear as what you just said, which I think is really clear and really true, that this is a human of enormous talent, but he's, you know, has done great damage, right, at the same time. And take that really to have a sober view of this human being.
No, and that's what I was. That's kind of my, you
Like
know, at various
sober
parts of the rise and fall of Marshall. Yeah, well, at the various parts of the rise and fall of the podcast, like that's part of my frustration with it, to be honest, is that I don't feel like there really has been. I feel like we've told a dramatic story.
Yes.
But there, like, and the sober accounting needs to be on both sides of this, because there were a lot of people that came to church, got baptized, and are Christians today as a result of Mars Hill, the church in Seattle, that would not have been otherwise, right? That were drawn in by this person. And there were a bunch of people who were hurt along the way as a result of the sins of this person and this ministry. And I don't feel like either side really wants to have that conversation. I don't feel like we want to talk about the failures of the non-Mars Hill church in Seattle and why it was that they were so appealing, and why it was that so many people like around the country were tuning in to hear Mark Driscoll's sermons. Like, what was it that was, where was the rest of the church for these people? We don't want to have that conversation, or at least part of us don't. And then part of the church doesn't want to have the other conversation about, okay, and not but this guy and this ministry also hurt a lot of people along the way in doing it. Like, both of these things are true. And so that kind of sober recognition of both of these things, that's what I wanted out of the rise and fall of our Hill podcast. And I didn't get it, because I got variably, like, I got a very dramatic story. And so, like, but it didn't leave me satisfied coming from that, because I was like, it's both of these things. And if we can't be honest about both of these things, and we can't be honest about the failures of the mainline Protestant church that was underserving, I mean, it's underserving the entire country, but like in Seattle, like it's a corpse, right? It's nothing. And Mars Hill filled something there that was good. And we're just like, we're not talking about that. And then the other people want to say, well, no, Mars Hill did a lot of great things, and you know, some misunderstandings or whatever, and we want to undermine or downplay what Mark did. And like I said, there were some people that were lifelong committed Christians that I know who have not gone to church in a decade because of, and I don't know that they will ever return because of what they experienced at Mars Hill. So those are both true. Like,
yeah, I'm just curious, as a culture, why are we so shy about making moral judgments? I mean, and I'm talking about sober moral judgments. I think people throw accusations everywhere. But it's curious to me that Mars Hill Rise and Fall made you kind of feel like, ooh, that was a cool thing, and that was interesting, but it didn't really go anywhere. What was the message? Was there a message?
I don't know, Paul, did you get it? I'm probably too close to it Paul, do you have a take? Like, do you feel like a message was being said?
I thought the message was classic Christianity today, in that it sort of wanted to be psychological. It wanted to bring in, so it brought in a group of experts that are sort of mostly leaning progressive evangelical. The message was, well, if you, towards the end of the last episode, it's, this one person who had been on staff, her and her husband finally landed in a church that's actually worshiping in the same place that the Ballard congregation met, and they're evangelical.
Are you talking about the Schmitz?
Could be.
I
think there are a lot of Dutch names in there, which of course caught my
I think
attention.
that was the Schmitz. The Schmitz actually did our premarital counseling at Marcel, but I think that's them. Yeah.
So the message was kind of, well, if it was sort of a soft progressive evangelical message that all we really need to have done is, and this is big in my own denomination, all we really need to do is just update the church a little bit and everything will be fine. And I don't buy that. It doesn't work. And Jim, I listened to your story and I listened to Tripp. He gets to Seattle. Where's he going to go to church? Because, hey, I'm a pastor of a small dying church. I get that. And I get the weirdness of the church and the strangeness of the pastor and the bad music. And I get all of that stuff. Yeah. But, my question is, on one hand, we have this, since Vietnam and Watergate, we have a deep crisis in our culture about institutions. Yeah. Because we all know that on one hand, well, some of us can be monks and live off our books and, get the opportunity to teach a class on how to make life worth living. And, and I kind of get that because I got my little church, I got my little podcast. So I've carved out a nice little space for myself. But the truth is that people need institutions and communities to help them achieve what they could never achieve on their own. And the church ideally is supposed to be a big part of that. And, part of, I think, what has kept conservative churches in the game in terms of North America and the United States has been the fact that at least they had a church planting movement that you'd get lots of trying, at least, and you'd get lots of failing, but at least there was trying. And one of the big differences between the mainline and the evangelicals is mainliners don't plant churches. And part of the reason they don't plant churches is because, however you want to deal with this theologically, Bill Hybels said, the church is the hope of the world because, people who are far from Jesus Christ may face an eternity without him. Therefore, we need to go out and part of that ethos then, interesting. And I thought, again, your book was very honest about this. And it's been my experience too. Conservative churches go out and actually wind up doing both. And again, I'm in a denomination that's moderate enough where I've seen people say, well, the worship and the evangelism and all that, that's a little uncomfortable. We're going to go out and we're going to plant communities that are doing community revitalization. And we hope out of that we'll get a worshiping community. Never happens. You plant the worshiping community with the zeal and the missionary ethos, and then you get the food kitchens and the ministry to the homeless and the family ministries. You get all of that. And you also get it not just sort of, more liberal leaning churches like to, well, we're going to fund loaves and fishes in Sacramento to deal with the homeless. No, the Pentecostals and the evangelicals, they want to go meet the homeless and they want to do it themselves. And so I think part of this story is we certainly need to continue to work on, in Christian terms, what's called the problem of wineskins, in that we need new institutions. And how are they all going to go? We don't know. But usually the way religion works is that a lot of people try stuff, and in the process, certain things begin to emerge that everyone says, yeah, that's better than this. We'll try that.
For sure. I guess, yeah, it's probably why I'm not a church pastor. It drives me, the kind of casualness of it all. It just drives me crazy. I want to do a program. I mean, I love nothing more than to go lecture for 2 hours. And basically, I don't want to have too much interaction with students, to be honest. Then I want to go home, and then I want to study, and then I want to prepare for the next day. And so it's all about content. It's not about, like for a pastor, it's all about the interaction and, coffee hour and all that kind of stuff, which drove me crazy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean.
I totally get what you're saying. I mean, it's just, anyway.
But you're still living within an institution too.
For sure.
You have a salary, you have benefits, you have a room provided, students pay tuition, and the university grew out of the church, and in some ways became, for Protestants, the alternative to the monastic communities. Really, the university and the nuclear family replaced the monastery in Christian history for Protestants. And another piece of the Jordan Peterson story has been the struggle of the university going forward. And again, these things move very slowly. So at the end of the 19th century, there's a lot of working out, well, what do we do with our theological departments? How do our theological departments relate to the physical science departments? And then the social science comes on board. And so the secular university basically says, well, we're not going to be steered by a theological department. We're just going to do all of the knowledge. And I think in some ways, with all of the upheavals in universities, we're getting to the question of, there needs to be a moral conversation. How do we frame and institutionalize that moral conversation? Which is again, showing the absence of what used to be at the center of the university, but we said, we can't agree on the confessionalist points. So let's just drop it and keep doing all of our other disciplines.
I know. I mean, the moral and spiritual aspects of this are so powerful. And that's why I went into the church, and then I couldn't find it there. Yeah. And so I had to go to the university, which I think you're right, is more monastic-like. And so you simply, you withdraw, you do your work, then you go present, then you withdraw. And it has, you interact with students, but not so much. But the church, I don't know. Then, so the church in the liberal zone is kind of this spiritual, help serve the world institution. In the evangelical zone, it's more like, I need to bring people to Christ. That's my purpose. I don't know. I don't have any answers on this one.
I will say that what's interesting about Mars Hill was that they were very, very deliberate about finding talented people within the church, like people who could teach or disciple or care or do all these kind of things, and encourage them and elevate them within the church to actually do those things. And that was different than a lot of the other churches that I've been in, where it's kind of like you go, there might be a Bible study that you go to and those kind of things, but there's no like there's no like obvious like role for me within the church other than just like showing up and tithing essentially, and maybe going to a Bible study. And so Marcel was very deliberate about that. And that's something similar to maybe like the university, where you'll find a talented student and or someone like that, and like, okay, I'm going to work with them, we're going to write a book together. Like you had, you know, some of your former students or colleagues work with you on your books. Like that was something that the church did, that Mars Hill did, that I thought kind of, I feel like it generated a culture of creation in a way that you don't get in a lot of other churches as well. And so I wonder whether or not that's one of the major pieces missing, is that people like they show up and there's just no like, what am I going to do? What place do I have in this church? And there's no like forward movement in the church at all. It's just kind of like show up, tithe, you know, go to a Sunday school class maybe or something like that. But like Marcel is very deliberate. Once they found someone who said something one time that was insightful in a Bible study or something like that, all of a sudden there's an elder or a pastor getting coffee with you and be like, hey, like, you know, to Paul's point, like they're almost like recruiting people to plant churches or to start things and those kind of, and so like there's this forward motion of finding it's discipleship, right? Like that was the idea. That's how they described it. Is like we're finding disciples to go and make disciples. Like we're forward moving and those kind of things. And so that was kind of the ethos of Mars Hill too, which is I think also one of the reasons that they were successful for so long, is because you, like you were saying earlier, Jim, like you just don't find like there's not as much talent going into the mainline like churches, and like it was almost like Mars Hill was a recruiting ground for talent for the church, in ways that I never experienced that before.
Yeah, Tripp, I mean, and that's kind of embarrassing because, you know, I think we live in a culture where Christians have to be nice, and you know, you can't say, I suppose, you know, you're really a crappy preacher. You're not a preacher. You shouldn't be preaching. Except, you know, you can't even see, you can't do it. You can't discipline your people that way. I don't know. It's a tough business. I would never want to be in a church because it's just so, everything's squishy.
Except,
you know what I mean, Paul?
But this is where the megas were different. So when I got to Sacramento, I had been in the missionary service. I'd been out of the church world for 7 years, and we had a Willow Creek junket that our classes sent me on. And so I spent about 2 years reading a ton of megachurch literature, and all of the stuff that you described, Tripp, is orthodoxy for how to run a megachurch. And that's another interesting piece of Mars Hill. They first began sort of as an emergent, dumping on the megas, but then totally embracing it, because in a lot of ways, the megachurch is the institutional deployment of a ton of social science research on how to mobilize, structure, and institutionalize these movements to achieve a particular ends. And that's part of the reason of the success of megachurches in America, because they have, in fact, professionalized it. You can gain some of that in small churches just by virtue of abject need, but you will not get the full range of opportunities and especially ministries that you can get from a megachurch. But again, the Mars Hill story is also this warning tale that the power of celebrity that megachurches require distorts and tempts the celebrity leaders at the center of it. So there's a ton here.
Yep. And not just the people at the center of it, like it, you know, that emanates out, right, to like the entire ministry and the people below it, because now you start to see things through the lens of that distortion field at the very top. And so that is the danger of it. At the same time, like you had people like at Mars Hill, that, you know, these were CFOs, you know, they joined the church. They were CFOs from major companies from other places. Like, these were all very talented people that knew what they were doing. Major theologians, people with PhDs all over the place, teaching and like that kind of stuff. So like, and then recruiting, you know, everyone, you know, top down, and kind of arranging the entire flock in such a way that it would be the most effective. It's a corporation.
Yeah.
Right.
At a fraction of the cost of the university.
Fraction of the cost. And so that's what, like, it's both powerful, but then you do have that reality distortion that comes from the top, that comes from the celebrity pastor.
And the success.
Yes. And
we go to Mars Hill. Oh,
yeah, totally. Yes. And, you know, I mean, it's just a fascinating thing. So like, I mean, my takeaway is they're both positive and negatives, from Mars Hill, you know, from my experience, for that reason, because there were some distortions that I see now. At the same time, like, you know, there was a lot of good that happened too, and a lot of things that I learned while I was there that are positive. So,
well, I've promised you guys 2 hours, and you gave me 2 hours. I'm not going to go beyond that, because, you know, that's what we've agreed to. But I thank you both. This has been terrific. I knew it would be, but this has been terrific. And yeah, any final comments or ideas either of you want to share before, or any books you want to plug, Jim?
Yeah, Jim, any new books coming out?
No, I wish there were. No, I don't have anything to plug, you guys. I should.
Okay.
That's terrible. I mean,
well,
you know,
I will plug for you.
Oh,
For anyone listening, please, like, High on God and Evangelical versus Liberal. Those are the 2 books that I've read of Jim's, and they are both really, really good. And I highly recommend them. So
I was going to say this, is that the High on God book came out sort of at exactly the wrong time, because just in the midst of all the controversies of Trump and, you know, sort of the implosion of the American evangelical church in so many ways. What I provide in High on God is really how amazing these churches are in terms of creating small towns wherever they go. And I wish people would read the book, and it tells you exactly the steps by which and how each of these churches works. And when we really looked at it, you guys, we found that these churches were creating enormous amounts of good for people in their communities, both in terms of those who were involved, but also for those who were in need in their communities. And, you know, it just came out the wrong time. And, you know, this is the book people are reading, right?
Yeah. And
basically this book tells you that this book is all a lie, and at its heart is terrible corruption. What's hysterical about this is the amount of research in this book. I actually went to these churches. We actually talked to these people. You guys, and I'm promoting right now, is what we found, and we did the sociological research. Only 1% of all American megachurches go into some form of corruption and disaster. 1%.
Yeah.
If you took that into corporations, you'd be in pretty good shape. But what do we hear about?
Right.
All we hear about is Donald Trump and all the crazy evangelicals who are, you know, invested in him. So it's kind of sad. I don't know what to do about it. And you know, that's just the way it is. There you go.
No,
I'm not giving up.
I'm glad that I read High on God before I read Jesus and John Wayne, because that like I was shaking my head through that book. A lot.
And a lot of small church pastors dump on mega churches, I think basically out of envy.
Yeah.
There's that too.
For
But
sure.
but mega churches get a really bad rap. But when I read your book, I was sort of, this way with respect to it. But I thought your book opened my eyes to a lot of things. And I think in a lot of ways, the mega church has sort of replaced the establishment cathedral church at the center of American culture, at least for a part of it, because American culture is massive. And that's something we seldom appreciate when we see the culture through the lens of whatever social media or mainline media that we're looking at it through.
Exactly. Yeah. So anyways, fun chatting, you guys. Enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well,
Thank
thank
Tell
you both.
Brooke I said hello, Jim.
I will. And
Right.
back at your family, man.
Will do.
We miss you.
Yeah. Well, we'll see you in a couple months at least.
When he
we'll
comes
be back
for
out
the
there in July.
weather.
All
Yes.
right. Okay, guys.
Thank you both. Take
Take-
care.
Peace.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.